The climate is changing. Extreme weather is disrupting livelihoods and food supplies around the world. This is observed. This is documented. This is the scientific community's consensus. The climate is changing. Carbon emissions are driving that change. Emissions come from burning fossil fuels. So if we want to slow or even reverse the change, we must lower our fossil fuel use. By charging a fee on fossil fuels and returning that revenue to households as a dividend, we can do just that, starting a chain of positive effects. Fossil fuels become less desirable. Cleaner sources of energy become more competitive. The dividend creates millions of jobs. Carbon emissions go down. Reduced air pollution saves tens of thousands of lives. And climate change is brought under control. We can make this happen. But enacting a carbon fee and dividend isn't in our hands. It's in theirs. How do we sway them? What can we do? We can use our voices to express political will and demand action. We must help our elected leaders work together. It's on us to tell them what we want as a group. Because when voices call out together, their impact multiplies. The government can respond to the will of the people, provided we tell the government what we want. And what we want is a livable world. This is what Citizens Climate Lobby works for, to empower citizens to connect with and influence their members of parliament, to spread the idea that each one of us can address climate change. Bring your voice to citizensclimatelobby.ca.
Good evening. Welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation. My name is Nicole Langlois. I'm a publications editor with the International Law Research Program at CG, and I am also a member of Divest Waterloo in my personal life. Our group exists to support organizations and individuals in the transition to a low-carbon economy through fossil fuel divestment. Before going further, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our gathering this evening is on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. On behalf of Divest Waterloo and Citizens Climate Lobby, tonight's 2 main organizing groups, I would like to extend our thanks to CG, and in particular to President Rohinton Medora and our events and digital media staff for hosting and fully supporting this event. We are, of course, grateful to the various experts who enthusiastically agreed to be part of tonight's panel. Their willingness to share their research and ideas with us is greatly appreciated. As I'm sure you all know, our federal government has invited public input as it develops a comprehensive climate strategy in pursuit of meeting its ambitious commitments to the historic Paris Agreement on climate change. A full public consultation for this region is planned for next Thursday, August 18th at 7 p.m. at Kitchener City Hall. I encourage all of you to attend the consultation, as well as the pre-consultation information session that begins at 5:30 that evening, as a means of registering your thoughts and opinions on this critical matter. You can find out more about what we have planned for August 18th at our information table in the lobby or on the events page of the Divest Waterloo website. I would like to acknowledge and thank the local environmental groups that have teamed up with Divest Waterloo and Citizens Climate Lobby to plan next week's consultation and who have supported our efforts to bring all of us together tonight. Those groups are Sustainable Waterloo Region, the Waterloo Regional Labour Council, Transition KW, REAP Green Solutions, Sustainable Campus Initiative, Chippewas of the Thames Solidarity Working Group, Waterloo Region Blue Dot Movement, and the People's Climate March Waterloo. We are here tonight to talk about what our federal government can and should do about the threats posed by climate change, threats to our personal and collective security, our livelihoods, and even our survival as a species. I ask you to consider for a moment the constraints within which policymakers have always worked: finite monetary resources, the legal duty of care they owe their constituents, and the pressures of an electorate that can be at times fickle and self-interested. Now consider that with the crisis of climate change, 2 new constraints must be added to the policymaker's burden: the non-negotiable limit to how much carbon our fragile ecosystems can bear, and the limit of how much time we have left to act. At no time in history has it been more important for our policymakers to think beyond a 4-year election cycle. At no time has it been more apparent that we must abandon the modern illusion of having it all. If we are to mitigate the most deleterious effects of climate change, if we are to adapt to the changes that are coming, some of which indeed are already here, and if we are to foster a society that is based on principles of justice and human dignity for all, choices must be made, and some of those will be difficult. Being informed and clear about our choices and preparing to express those choices to our elected representatives in Parliament is why we are here tonight. I would now like to turn the evening over to my colleague, Andrew Thompson, a CG Senior Fellow in the Global Security and Politics program. Andrew is also an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo, the program officer for the global governance programs at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and chair of Amnesty International Canada. He is the co-host of Inside the Issues, CG's weekly international affairs podcast, and he has graciously agreed to moderate this evening for us. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Nicole. It is a great honor and privilege to be tonight's moderator. And for this evening, each panelist will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and we will go in the order in which they are seated, beginning from my far right. Following the presentations, we will have about 30 to 40 minutes for questions from the audience. And for the question and answer period, I invite people to come to the 2 microphones that are located just in the main aisle here. Before you ask your question, please do introduce yourself. And I invite you to ask questions of the entire panel or particular members of the panel. And I do ask that you keep your question short and focused so that we do have time for as many questions as possible. We have an absolutely stellar cast of panelists tonight. Sarah Birch is a CG Senior Fellow with the Global Economy Program and an Assistant Professor in the Department of Geography and Environment Management in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, where she researches climate change, urban planning and responses to climate change, and renewable energy. Sarah is a coordinating lead author of the second assessment report on cities and climate change and was a contributing author to the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. She holds a PhD in Resource Management and Environment Studies from the University of British Columbia, as well as a BA in International Relations and a Bachelor of Science in Environment Science from the university, both from the University of Calgary. She's held a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Oxford's Environmental Change Institute and a Banting postdoctoral fellowship at the University of British Columbia. Heather Douglas is the Waterloo Chair in Science and Society in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Waterloo. She received her PhD from the History and Philosophy of Science Department at the University of Pittsburgh and earned a BA in Philosophy and Physics at the University of Delaware. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation. She has recently been a visiting fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. She has served on numerous scientific advisory boards, and her work focuses on the interface between science and policy, with particular attention to the role of values in science, the nature of scientific integrity, the relationship between citizens and experts in democracies, and the norms that should govern the weighing of complex sets of evidence use in policymaking. Katarina Lindman is an actuary and mother of 4. She's very interested in ecology, health, and climate change. She enjoys working with other actuaries and climate scientists on the challenge of communicating the state of science with others through the development of the Actuaries Climate Index, which will be launched in the fall. Katarina also works on climate policy by leading the Waterloo Region chapter of the nonpartisan Citizens Climate Lobby. Maria Penezi is a postdoctoral fellow with CG's International Law Research Program. She holds a PhD in law from Osgoode Hall School at York University, where she was a Nathanson Fellow and a Comparative Law and Political Economy Fellow. She received her first law degree from Athens University in Greece and was called to the Athens bar. She's published articles on issues related to public international law and was a W.C. Langley Scholar of International Legal Studies at New York University School of Law, where she received her LLM. Maria has been an adjunct professor at Osgoode Hall Law School and has taught ethical lawyering in a global community, as well as law and economics, for which she received the Ian Green Award for Teaching Excellence. She has also been a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Last but not least, Professor Deborah McGregor joined the Osgoode Hall Law School faculty in 2005 as a cross-appointee with York University's Faculty of Environment Studies. Professor McGregor's research is focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including water and environmental governance, environmental justice, forest policy and management, and sustainable development. Her research has been published in a variety of national and international journals, and she has delivered numerous public and academic presentations relating to Indigenous knowledge systems, governance, and sustainability. She has recently completed a SSHRC-funded research project, Traditional Knowledge, Water, and First Nations in Ontario, and is currently involved in 3 additional studies. Prior to joining Osgoode, Professor McGregor was an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Toronto and served as director for the Centre for Aboriginal Initiatives Aboriginal Studies program. She also served as senior policy advisor, Aboriginal Relations at Environment Canada, Ontario region. In addition to such posts, Professor McGregor remains actively involved in a variety of Indigenous communities, serving as an advisor and continuing to engage in community-based research. Please join me in welcoming tonight's panel. So we will start with Sarah.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I wanted to draw attention to this full house. This is really incredible. I wouldn't presume that all of you agree with each other on this issue, but it's striking to have this many interested people in the room together on a very hot and steamy evening to talk about a pretty complex issue that I think really comes home to roost, as I'll discuss here in communities like Kitchener-Waterloo. As Andrew mentioned, I'm at the University of Waterloo. I'm in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management. I'm sometimes a political scientist, sometimes a geographer, but I focus on how climate change plays out in communities. What municipalities, what urban spaces can do to respond to the challenge of climate change, and also broader, deeper sustainability issues. And so that's what I'm here to speak with you about today, about the ways that we can view climate change sort of through the lens of sustainability. Consider all of the things that we want our communities to be, to chart a path forward for Canada. Wrong green button. We're in a time of incredible change in the world. We have evidence accumulating upon evidence that change is accelerating. We're in the midst of this great acceleration, rapid migration from rural to urban, accelerating consumption of resources, but not all of this is bad. And I struggle with jumping down the rabbit hole of the doom and gloom we often associate with climate change, because it tends to be fairly disempowering. We lose the wind in our sails when the problem seems so massive. But obviously on social and economic indicators, we are actually making some significant improvements all around the world. And so I think it's most important to think of this time we find ourselves in as a period of massive change. Clearly, one of those dimensions of change is our emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, leading to, as we know and have observed, significant climate change. So this is an important thing to reflect on in our communities. In Canada, we're also in a period of massive change. We obviously just had a change in government, and we're in this current process of consulting on what Canada should now do in terms of a nationwide and province-by-province climate change action plan. We self-identify, it would seem, as a resource-based economy, of course, and that has created, I would think, many roadblocks to transition towards renewable energy and low-carbon living in Canada. It turns out we're also a renewable energy superpower as well. We have spectacular resources in this country. They vary province by province, but the resources are available to trigger a transition, to foster a transition towards renewable energy, if only we are to take the tools in hand that other panelists will be discussing throughout the evening to trigger that transition. But I think it's important to bring all this down to where we all live, to understand what the impacts of climate change and responding to climate change actually mean in cities. And then this needs to trickle back up to the federal level and inform our national level climate change plan. So we have to think about our cities. This is where it happens. This is where the climate change impacts play out. This is where renewable energy transitions play out. This is where our local economies are, our small businesses. But this is where we work and live and play. So the structure of our cities, the way they function, has incredible impacts on what we can see as our future with or without climate change. So let's look at our cities. I'd like to use a couple of images here just to bring it home for you. Some work that I've done in the past over the last number of years. I'm a relatively recent import, 3 or 4 years now from Vancouver, from the University of British Columbia. And we've done significant work along the coast and in mountain-based communities to actually visualize, create a vision for what climate change means in communities in 2020, 2050, 2100. What do communities look like, and how do we respond? Do we want our community to go down a particular path, like densification, like rapid transit? And what does it look like when we make those changes? So this is a 3D digitally reproduced image of the community of Delta. It's a low-lying, very vulnerable community that experiences flooding and storm surge. It's surrounded on 3 sides by water. And this is what it looks like right now. This is what happens when the dike breaches, when sea levels go up by, in fact, very little. The dikes breach in Delta even now. And so if we have sort of a scenario where there's a storm surge as well as a modest sea level rise, this community floods. So this is what it can look like. This is actually what it does look like on occasion when Delta floods. But if we look forward and we plan, obviously, there are ways to respond to and to adapt to climate change in this community. One way to do that is to simply build a bigger wall. That is one option available to communities to keep out this particular climate change impact. But we run into dangers here. If we are taking a very narrow lens on climate change and thinking only about protecting our communities from one single impact, we lose opportunities to find synergies with other priorities that matter to us. So what other options do we have available to us? We could build what they call a green berm. There are examples from all around the world of ways to adapt to climate change that don't involve building a big concrete wall. This, for instance, would create recreational opportunities for this neighborhood. It would sink carbon because it's green and growing instead of concrete. Aesthetically, perhaps more pleasing, enhancing biodiversity in this area instead of cutting right through potentially ecologically sensitive areas. So the point here is to stretch our imaginations, to look around the world, to learn lessons from communities that are a few steps ahead of us, and implement climate change strategies that deliver on multiple priorities simultaneously. I think that's a key message here for both cities, provinces, and the federal government. But we need to do more than simply adapt. What we're talking about here in large part is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating climate change. So this image shows putting those houses up on stilts to also preserve them from rising sea levels. Starting to put some solar panels on top in smaller cars so that fuel consumption is reduced, and essentially gathering that low-hanging fruit of climate change mitigation or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So these are strategies that are available to municipalities, but are most effective and accelerated by strong ongoing, and well-funded partnerships at all levels of government. So this requires policy consistency between municipal governments, provincial governments, and federal governments, as well as significant flows of resources among those. And finally, let's think about a more deeply sustainable world. Sorry for whoever I'm lasering over there. As I mentioned, lower greenhouse gas emissions is not our only goal. We want, I presume, I hope, healthier communities, more equitable communities, more beautiful, livable communities, as well as cities that are resilient to climate change impacts and lower carbon. This is one vision of Delta in a deep sustainability scenario where we have more local food production, local renewable energy production, different architectural designs, and all sorts of things going on the ground. I would like to highlight that in the case of Delta, one could argue that because of its vulnerability to rising sea levels and storms, it would be most sustainable for Delta to actually not be here at all. So that would be one deeply sustainable world in 2100, would be to not have to rebuild it over and over or protect it so deeply. So this is a tough conversation, and whole countries are having this conversation in other parts of the world. What I'd like to highlight here is the importance of convening people from all walks of life, from all stakeholder groups, if we call you that, to talk about what your vision for a sustainable community is, and acknowledging that it varies from community to community. And my vision of sustainability might not be yours, and that's okay. This allows us to stack up these options side by side and really explore what is available to us, what we might expect to see under a changing climate, and how we can respond. Ultimately, the point I'd like to make here is that we have a window of opportunity at the federal level, and obviously an incredible amount is going on provincially and also locally on climate change, to transform communities that look like this, very common vision, big broad streets, lots of room for cars and not much else, into something that looks a little bit more like this. We're in the midst of an incredible transition right in this very neighborhood that would bring in a lot of what you see here, but perhaps more opportunities for local food, for rapid transit, for small-scale renewable energy production, active transportation, etc. In this image, there is so much going on that requires the active engagement of not just the usual suspects. And one unusual suspect that I'd like to highlight that would play a significant role in a transformation of the community from what you saw before to this is the small and medium-sized enterprise sector. Small and medium-sized businesses are responsible for a massive portion of our collective greenhouse gas emissions, and yet, because of their multitudes and because of their sparse resources and their diversity, we rarely coordinate them. We rarely knit them together and work with small businesses to trigger this sustainability transition. And yet, it's my belief, and I think a fair bit of evidence demonstrates that SMEs small businesses are an incredible source of innovation on climate change and sustainability. So I would ask that we strongly consider a nationwide strategy for engaging small businesses on responding to climate change and sustainability challenges. I'd like to leave you with these key messages about where I think my domain of scholarship and practice suggests we ought to go in terms of a federal climate change strategy. We need a vision. This vision is deeply local and is not one that can be brushed across the nation. Obviously, there's incredible variety from city to city and province to province. But there are some qualities of this vision that make it more compelling, I think, and more practical. That is that these visions are produced at the local level, that they are holistic, that we think of our cities as whole systems, not simply just about climate change, but about biodiversity and health and equity and economic prosperity. That we consider equity, of course, as we implement tools like a carbon tax or a carbon fee and dividend, and other incentives and disincentives for greenhouse gas emissions. That we think about this in terms of net positive. We can do better than just slightly less bad, I think, I hope. So this is the challenge I would put to you. is that just marginally reducing the disastrous impact that we have had, and I don't mean to say that facetiously, on species, on communities, on the climate. Just slightly reducing that should not be where our ambition stops. So looking to actually improve, go beyond just slightly less bad in our communities on a suite of priorities, and think about transformation instead. I'm going to tee this up for others at the table, but of course, pricing carbon through a number of different mechanisms is one dimension of triggering the innovation, of triggering the transitions that we need. And I believe that small businesses are a particularly neglected and particularly powerful sector to engage and coordinate in responding to climate change, both municipally and all the way to the federal level. Thanks very much.
Torch has been passed. I want to thank Nicole for organizing this, and thank you all for coming. It's a full house, it's spectacular, to discuss with us this important and challenging issue. The focus of my presentation will be on local energy planning and how to think about the ways in which the federal and provincial levels of government in Canada can assist with local energy planning efforts. Because as Sarah, I think, emphasized, really, in thinking about how to address climate change, it's at the local level that we use energy and that we decide how to use it. So that's where the decisions have to be made, but they shouldn't be made in isolation, and they can't be made without support from the federal and provincial levels. Hopefully we'll get something concrete out of this too. I know I'm a philosopher, so you might not like it. Maybe it needs to be even more concrete, but hopefully we'll get something concrete out of it too. Okay, so in our region right now, 90%, over 90%, I think it's about 94% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from energy use. So that's really where the challenge is for the Waterloo region. If we want to reduce our contribution to the climate problem, we have to address how we use energy systematically. Decarbonizing our energy infrastructure is going to require local planning. This is partly because the great thing about energy is that it's invisible. We all like to plug in our device and it gets charged. We like to start our cars and have them take places. We like our houses to be comfortable, and we like not to think about it too much. And I don't want to suggest that that's a bad thing. In fact, I think that's a good thing. I think that's part of what makes us a productive society. But that means that at this moment in time, we have to think about how the energy gets to us, what the sources are. We're at a decision point where we have to begin to really think and plan so that we can have an energy infrastructure that will be seamless, that will be invisible, and will be carbon-free. Hopefully by 2050. That's what I'm going to try to aim for. So this means we're going to have to change the way in which our infrastructure functions. We're going to think about that boring, horribly unsexy stuff, infrastructure, for at least a little while. But this, I think, is a tremendous opportunity. So while infrastructure might be boring, it also can be a driver for the local economy, because changes in infrastructure are a great source of local jobs. In addition, the kinds of businesses that will create that transformation can create new economies, both locally and outsourcing to other communities that might be interested in that. And finally, if we actually are able to generate our energy locally and carbon-free, that means all of the money we spend on energy stays in the local economy. That's great for the local economy. So those are some reasons to think that we have just not just a challenge, but an opportunity. In addition, in thinking about how to think about energy infrastructure for the local area, I think I want to emphasize, again with Sarah's talk, the opportunity to think through how we want to live. What kind of community do we want to have? To make it more beautiful and more aesthetic, to make Waterloo Region an even better place to live than it is now, in terms of all the sort of amenities. So can we find those synergies that both decarbonize our energy infrastructure and make this place an even better place to live? The good news is it's already started. So it's not like we have to start from scratch. There is the Community Energy Investment Strategy that is begun by the Waterloo Region. There is Sustainable Waterloo Region, which is coordinating all kinds of efforts across the region to think these things through. And in the fall, I'll be hosting an expert forum on decarbonization that will be bringing together local experts to think this through. And hopefully you'll be hearing results from that of pathways and futures that will be decarbonized coming out of that forum. Stay tuned. November 18th, hopefully we'll have some results for you, right? So this has already started. The question then before us is, how do we support these efforts? What do we want from the federal levels and from the provincial levels to help us make this a reality? So for federal support for local energy planning, I think clearly pricing carbon is important for all kinds of reasons. We need that price signal in the economy to show us that using fossil fuel energy, in fact, costs the environment and our communities more than we have actually being charged for it. It also, I think, could be a wonderful source of revenue. I know the climate law, like it to be, everything goes back to the citizens, but I actually think we should keep some of that money to support the infrastructure transitions that we need. And I think equity consideration should be really important in those infrastructure transitions so that impoverished communities that are currently under-resourced for energy now should get extra special attention for the infrastructure money, but we're going to need funds to make these transitions. And we could use perhaps carbon pricing to help generate some of those funds. I also think we have existing institutions that we are not leveraging adequately that could help us really make this transition. So if we consider the way in which we finance, buy and finance home purchasing right now, I know that the province is considering setting up a green bank to help do this differently, but why don't we change all of our house funding? Why don't we change the way we do all of our mortgages and all of our house assessments and all of our market listings so that energy is transparent? There's the EnerGuide ratings, these are developed by NRCan. They could be required as part of any market listing that you have an EnerGuide rating attached to a home before it gets listed in the market. So everyone can see, is this a home that's going to cost me a lot in terms of energy or not? How energy efficient is it? This would allow homeowners to have a tremendous moment of opportunity. Well, should we, once we get the EnerGuide rating, do we want to do retrofits now before we put it on the market? And then all of the sort of incentive funds that are now out there would become, you'd have an opportunity to think about the infrastructure that you live in and to utilize those more effectively. In addition, I would like to see homeowners who have higher efficient homes get benefits. So I think those houses that do well on the EnerGuide system, or even net zero or net positive, they might be more expensive to build, but that energy rating should be built into the assessment of the home. It shouldn't just be square footage and neighborhood, so that you can get a higher mortgage for it. In addition, you should have lower mortgage rates. And this could actually really sort of turn the whole financial system that we use currently for our home financing and leverage it towards making these transformations feasible. In addition, the federal government can do a lot to work with provinces to strengthen building codes. I understand the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation used to actually do a lot of research on how to build houses. That would be great to see them doing that kind of research again and helping provinces think about what kind of building codes how could building codes be strengthened in the particular provincial areas where they have the particular climate issues that they do, what should actually be done? What would ideal housing codes look like? In addition, the federal government could assist provinces in thinking through the planning efforts and the utility regulation changes that need to happen to make this work for across our energy sector. So at a certain point in time, we're going to have to turn to the provincial level. Unfortunately, the federal government can't do it all. Canada's a decentralized political system. So I know we're not supposed to be talking about this tonight, but I think it's important to bring it up. So I think there are all kinds of things the province can do. The province has the province of Ontario has begun doing some of this. So they are, for example, strengthening the building codes, the minimum floor. But it'd be really great if, in addition to strengthening the building code across the province of Ontario, if in addition, different municipalities could opt into even more stringent building codes. So if, for example, they could do so locally in an ad hoc way, or if that's too crazy for builders, having tiers of aspirational building codes that we could actually ratchet ourselves up to eventually having not just net zero, but net positive buildings become the standard across of our infrastructure. And if that were the case, it becomes a lot easier to address a lot of these issues. In addition, the province should support municipal planning efforts, such as removing parking requirements for buildings, which does not help when you're trying to create dense, more walkable cities, to put parking lots in the middle of things. Does anyone here like to walk by parking lots? I hate it. It's an awful walking experience, and it makes our cities less walkable in general. Density planning also allows for district heating, more transit, and more walkability. And also helping us think through our sort of regional transit infrastructure, which I know the province is already very interested in. In addition, the province has the ability to change the way in which utilities are run across the province. Currently, utilities tend to think, electrical utilities certainly think in terms of base load and peak load. Are they meeting our demands? Are they keeping the energy invisible? But in addition to that, they should also be thinking about carbon impact. That should be part of what our utilities should be required to do, given how important it is. And net metering should become readily accessible by anyone if we have fit as well to sort of incentivize additional new renewable energy. That's fantastic. We need to figure out how much it's going to cost to do grid maintenance and figure out what that should mean. Should that be funded by the kind of green bond fund that we need, or is that sort of something that should be built into our a connection fee to the grid? And what should grid scale storage look like? Because we know renewables are intermittent, but there might be carbon neutral ways to do grid storage. There's compressed air, there's pumped hydro. I know some of my colleagues at the University of Waterloo are actually working on these issues. So they're interesting mechanisms that we need to think about, and those can be supported by both provincial and federal level initiatives. So, what I think we should think of this as being is how do we coordinate the jurisdictional levels between the local, the provincial, and the federal? How do we create the systems of not just carrots? We have lots of carrots out there, but where are the sticks to beat us collectively towards thinking through the infrastructure choices we need to make? This is an exercise in democracy, ultimately, in collective problem solving, and hopefully in imagining a better world for our community, and then in making it happen.
Okay, good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and I'd also like to thank Divest Waterloo and CG for partnering with Citizens Climate Lobby to put this event together. Oh, wait, sorry. Okay, so this is our logo, Citizens Climate Lobby. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how I got involved with Citizens Climate Lobby, and then about what Citizens Climate Lobby advocates for. And then lastly, I'll just give you a few more ideas about what we should be doing for climate solutions besides carbon pricing. So I was always interested in ecology, and I'm an actuary, and I had an opportunity to get involved with the development of the Actuaries Climate Index. That's going to be launched this fall, and it's an objective measure of how the climate has been changing in the United States and Canada. And as I got involved in that research, I wanted to do a little bit more than simply work on the index, which would kind of say, hey, there seems to be an issue with climate change. And quantifying that, which I think is necessary, but I wanted to get more involved with policy. And then I found Citizens Climate Lobby, and I like both what they're advocating for and how they do it. So you saw a little bit about carbon fee and dividend. The idea is to put a steadily rising price on carbon emissions. As we heard earlier, 94% of Waterloo Region's carbon emissions are due to the use of energy, so that would tax those forms of energy and then return that money to the citizens. And then that way, anyone who uses less, the money's returned equally. Everyone that uses less than average makes money on the deal. It's helpful to poor people because they tend to be more carbon virtuous, if you will. And the people that are wealthier can afford that. And the money goes back into the economy and creates jobs. And I also really like how Citizens Climate Lobby works. We're based on Gandhian principles of love and respect. So our tools for lobbying our members of parliament and also building relationships based on respect and gratitude. And we really help our politicians and our local media be the climate heroes we need. Climate change is a crisis, which in China, that's symbolized with two characters, one which means danger and the second means opportunity. So there is a very real danger that we're in trouble with our ecological system, that we could hit tipping points that would really just be quite horrible. And also there's an opportunity. So as Sarah said, we want to just not make it a little less bad or a little less awful. Our opportunity is actually to transform the world and make it better even before there was a crisis. Okay, so I'm going to just walk through what the essential elements of carbon pricing are to be effective. So we want a steadily rising, predictable, substantial price. We want the price to be substantial so that the impact is substantial. Globally, we've really dawdled on reducing emissions, and now it's at a point where it's very critical that we start to reduce emissions. The predictability helps businesses plan, so then energy companies can kind of decide, you know what, there's going to be this carbon tax. Building more pipeline infrastructure just doesn't make a lot of economic sense. Let's focus our attention elsewhere on the energy of the future. I think another essential element in Canada is that the federal price should overlay the provincial pricing. So we have some provincial jurisdictions that have announced a carbon price. I think the federal price should overlay it. So for example, let's say the federal price started at $30 a ton, which I think is a great place to start. If a province only has $20 a ton, the federal government would collect that extra $10. And that would really give the provinces an incentive to make sure their price is at least $30, because then they get to keep the money. And the size of the carbon price matters. At a minimum, we need $30 a ton in 2018, rising by $10 per ton per year. And that's based on projections of what impact that carbon price would have. In order to meet like our current targets, that's the size of carbon price we need. That price would rise to $150 a ton by 2030. It's very important that we get the price started soon and that we ramp it up quickly. 2030 is very critical. We need to meet 2030 to give us a chance to meet 2050. And so otherwise it becomes way more expensive and way more risky because there are tipping points. Just to give you an idea of an impact, for every $10 a ton, it raises the gas prices by 2.5 cents a liter. So given the recent volatility we've had in gasoline prices, this isn't really that bad, and it saves you from a very destructive possibility of runaway climate change. And then dividends, we think, is a good way of what to do with the money. because people will see transparently what's happening with that money. We just divide it up equally and give it back to people. It's broadly progressive because poor people use less carbon than richer people. So it helps with income inequality. I want to show you this chart. So now we're going into the various policy options. And this was created by the European Commission, which is the governing body of the European Union. And they were looking at what's the mitigation potential of various choices of how we could mitigate emissions. And they're in order from least effective to most effective. So the first one there is using less energy. Let's say everyone lowered their temperature by 1 degree Celsius, and that's how much, I think, gigatons it would save if everyone did that in the European Union. But better yet would be if we had telecommuting. So if people stayed home and worked from their homes so they don't have to commute, because then they would save all those driving and all those emissions associated with that to work. The next three have to do with cars, and so they're better yet, driving a hybrid, followed by driving a smaller car, and even better yet is driving an electric car, presumably with energy that's clean. But surprisingly, moving to a vegetarian diet is even better than all of those energy choices, and moving to a vegan diet is better yet. So I think that's something to consider. Carbon fee and dividend is sort of a thing we can do politically to move the needle. Changing to those eating less meat or eating less meat and eggs and dairy is something we can do personally, and we don't have to wait for a price on carbon to do that, although I want a price on carbon. Other essential policies, let's see, what's the first one? Okay, reduce consumption of animal products. And this has co-benefits. So I think that helps us move towards that not just a less bad world, but a better world. Reducing consumption of animal products would free up land that could then go back to being reforested. It will also improve human health. So I think it's a great idea to actually prevent diseases rather than getting chronic diseases and then treating them with our healthcare system. A lot less suffering, a lot less cost. Another essential policy is to promote organic agriculture. As we phase out fossil fuels, we need to remember that one of the uses of fossil fuels is to create chemical fertilizers. So then we want to get away from that. So then organic agriculture is another way to make our soils fertile by working with nature rather than against it, if you will. And this one, I think, represents what's been billed tonight as a bit of cutting-edge research, and that is making soils a carbon sink and more productive by using human wastes mixed with biochar as fertilizer. So closing that loop on human waste, so to return those nutrients back to the soil to help us grow more food. And this soil that's mixed with biochar is a lot more fertile, holds the water better, so it's more adapted to climate change. So I've just put together a few resources for people to learn more. I'm really glad that you came tonight to learn more about carbon pricing and other mitigation strategies. So here's some perhaps homework if you get inspired. One is the movie Forks Over Knives, which talks about the health impacts and the climate impacts of moving towards a whole foods, plant-based diet. Cowspiracy is a good movie about the environmental impacts of moving to that healthier eating. Nutritionfacts.org is a really good website about nutrition-based research. Just Eat It is a Canadian documentary about food waste, which is another huge issue that we have. And then Terra Preta is about biochar. I just finished reading that book, and I saw it's out for sale today by Wordsworth Books. Really fascinating, cutting-edge research. And then back to carbon pricing, the Eco-Fiscal Commission is a very good source of information about not only carbon pricing, but other tools that the government can use to make us better economically and environmentally all at the same time. And lastly, I invite you to see Citizens Climate Lobby's website. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to everyone for joining us and to my fellow panelists for starting this conversation that is very important in view of the discussions on carbon pricing policies. My presentation will take us all to a little trip to Geneva. Do we have the video to show?
We know that tackling climate change is a global priority, but what can be done about it? A sensible first step is for governments to hold their industries and consumers accountable for the cost of burning fossil fuels. Some governments are already doing this in various ways, but critics say carbon taxes will hurt national economies by making domestic industries less competitive and more expensive. Consumers might purchase cheaper products from countries where carbon taxes don't exist. Worse, domestic producers might relocate their production to countries with lower environmental standards. Consider two toys that look and work the same, but one is made locally with environmentally friendly processes and materials, and the other is very carbon intensive and imported into our market. Should consumers be enticed to purchase the cheaper, dirtier product? How can we encourage industries and consumers to choose products that take the environment into account? One answer is to ensure that imported products pay for their carbon footprint, just like domestic products, through a mechanism known as border carbon adjustments. From a business perspective, these border carbon adjustments would ensure that it's not just domestic producers who need to be accountable for their carbon emissions, but everyone else wishing to access our markets. For the 162 countries who are members of the World Trade Organization, border carbon adjustments have the added bonus of being compatible with countries' international trade obligations. The WTO's predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was signed in 1947, has pushed for the elimination of tariffs in the pursuit of free trade among its members. But the GATT included important clauses for countries to stray from their original commitments in exceptional circumstances. And Clause G of Article 20, as it pertains to exhaustible natural resources, is one of those clauses that can be used for the environment. For consumers, raising the price of carbon-intensive products incentivizes them to drift away from such commodities towards environment-friendly products. As the regulator of international trade, the World Trade Organization should applaud these efforts and embrace them by showing everyone this approach is legal. With tax revenues gained through border carbon adjustments, national governments could look to fund innovative environmental projects for their citizens, while helping build a clean global economy. Read CG's research on border carbon adjustments by visiting cgonline.org/bordercarbon.
After and assuming the adoption of a carbon pricing policy, the question that my research set out to ask is, what happens with imports? Let's say that we try to do our best and we put a price on carbon, but then what happens with all those dirty products or those products that are not carbon accountable that are coming from abroad? And this essentially moves us from thinking of a Canadian clean product, a Canadian clean production process, to a clean Canadian market. So all of the products circulating in the Canadian market being accountable for their carbon emissions. Is this possible? Why is this desirable, first of all? It's because if the domestic prices start rising, then cheaper imports will just take over and substitute for those Canadian products. Now, this is called carbon leakage. It means that the carbon will be produced somewhere else at the same time. Is there anything that can be done? There is a tool, and in the WTO law, jargon, the World Trade Organization jargon, this is called a border carbon adjustment. So the WTO is an organization which is based in Geneva. It has more than 160 members. I think we're now at 164. Someone joined just a couple of days ago, I think. What do? They regulate international trade. They have rules that say for all our members, the tariffs have to be non-discriminatory. You have to treat all your counterparties the same way. That's the basic principle. And over the years, the WTO has gone a little bit back and forth in the news from being a bad player for the environment to being a sort of non-important player for the environment, or sometimes it just falls off the news pages and we don't read about it at all. And the question that I set out to ask is those border carbon adjustments on imports that perhaps the WTO would be interested in, what are they? How do they work? And are they legal at the international level? Imagine the border carbon adjustments like a remote control for your TV. First, you have to get the TV and then the remote control. If you just have the remote control, nothing works. So what's the TV? The TV is the carbon pricing. You have to have a carbon price in Canada. That will be imposed on a product, and it will take it from $8 to $10, let's say. And for that foreign product that comes in at $8, the Canadian government will say at the border, well, in Canada we have a carbon tax. It's $2, so now for that same product that comes in, you will also pay $2. So the Canadian product and the foreign product will both be $10. They'll both be carbon accountable. And that extra add-on on the foreign product is called a border carbon adjustment. Every time somebody suggested that in the last 10 years, there's been a counter-argument. This might cause trade wars between countries. That is the counter-argument. So that's what the question I set out to answer was. Will there be trade wars? Is this something that can happen, or will Canada or any other country that decides to not only do a carbon price domestically, but start imposing that on foreign unaccountable products, will they get into trade wars? So in order to determine that in the WTO, that determination usually happens in court. They have this court system where at the first level there's the panels. The panels consist of 3 people. They sit, they examine the measure, and they issue the decision. And if countries reject that decision or they don't like it, they take it over to the appellate body. They appeal, and the appellate body's decision usually is final. This is one of the more active courts in international law. So we hear about the International Court of Justice or other courts. They issue very few decisions. The WTO is very active. They have overcome the 500 decision benchmark recently, and we started counting in 1995. So there were decisions before that in the WTO's previous version. It was called the GATT at the time. So then it kind of changed faces, and now it's called the WTO. So these are many decisions in international law. We usually don't have that much production at the court level. So what does the court look when they're looking at policies that countries adopt and they want to see if it violates the trade rules or not? They have this border carbon adjustment, and they will say, test phase 1. Is the price the same? It's an economic question. Is the price for the domestic product the same for the import? Are you treating those products equally? So if the price is $2 and $2, that test is passed. Now, when we talk about carbon pricing and carbon emissions, things get a little trickier. We can't always determine with such amount of certainty what the emissions were domestically and what the emissions were at the other side of the world. Japan, China, India, Germany, we're not so certain of what measure to use in order to determine how much was emitted there. So sometimes there are discrepancies. So do you lose the case if you don't have that $2 to $2 and somehow your products are slightly different? The answer is no, you don't lose the case automatically. There's an additional test that happens if you don't pass the economic test, and it's called a policy test. The WTO has this article with sort of a laundry list of options for countries to justify small discrepancies. That laundry list has options such as public morals, public health, animal and plant life and health, human health, obviously, and life. What other options are there? Yes, and of course, the one that would be most relevant to climate change is Article 20G, paragraph G, which says that for the conservation of exhaustible natural resources, members to the WTO countries can have some deviations from the rule as long as it's done for an environmental purpose. In other words, you can't try to protect the domestic industry just to make things safer for them and just impose the tax on the foreign products and say, oh, I was doing it for an environmental purpose. It really has to be for an environmental reason. And they have a fact-finding process that's quite remarkable and sophisticated to actually demonstrate that there is this environmental purpose for jacking up the price for the foreigners, too. So those two tests, the economic test first, that if you pass it, you're done, you don't need to go through the policy test, and the second one, that's sort of a net that catches the rest, are not so difficult to pass for a country if they wanted to impose that price on carbon for the foreign product. It has never been done to date for carbon pricing. And it's because nobody to date, no country, has adopted this border carbon adjustment policy. But in the last 5 years or so, carbon pricing has become a lot more plausible and politically easier to talk about. And after the Paris Agreement, it's been trending. And people talk about it more and more. So it is very possible that we will see something like that really soon, coming from somewhere, coming from a country that adopts a carbon pricing mechanism. And what is the challenge now for Canada if they wanted to do that? If Canada wanted to move forward with a carbon pricing and said, well, let's add this on. Let's get the TV together with a remote control. In that case, first we need a pan-Canadian price. And why do we need to do that? Why do we need a standard harmonized process? Is because you clean your own backyard first before you start pointing fingers. In other words, if you have a province that does a lot with respect to carbon pricing, like British Columbia, and then you have another province that says, I'm not going to do anything, I'm not going to price carbon, the WTO tells you, well, before you start pricing all those other unaccountable products that sit out there coming from other countries, first price yours. Find your own provinces, fix that first. That you can do before you start pricing others. That is very important. Now, it sounds a little difficult, right? A harmonized pan-Canadian price. And it's easier than it appears. And there's two reasons. The first one is the WTO doesn't look at a price in general like a blanket that covers everything. They look at it on a product-by-product basis. So they will always examine the price on cement, or the price on steel, or the price on fuel. And they will be very specific about it. So as long as we can all agree to a carbon price for those products that are high carbon emitters, that's good enough for the WTO. And then domestically, we can have a lot of other local policies affecting other products, but the WTO only cares for import's sake on a product-by-product basis. So that's important to bear in mind. It's not some blanket that will cover everything, that will change our lives so drastically from one day to the next. It's measured very specifically. And it does help industries compete in a fair environment, the domestic industries. And the second part that is often sort of sidestepped in this discussion is that we don't really need to all agree on a $30 on cement per ton and say that's what it is, $30. We can use minimum common denominators to determine the border carbon adjustment. So as long as we're all trying to do something, then we can take the province with the lowest price on that product and use that as a benchmark and adjust to that in the WTO. And then we move further. That pool of money will help us move further. And I want to go back to something that was mentioned before. the idea of revenue positivity. So what do you do with that money? You collect this pool of money from imports, right? So what do you do with it afterwards? And a lot of this discussion keeps insisting on revenue neutrality. So you just take it back, you put it in a pool of money that you collect anyway, and you redistribute it to the world. The WTO, I think, would like it more in order to pass that test of the policy, the second test, if the money was not redistributed in a revenue-neutral way, but instead went back to the environment. This would show this commitment to the environmental cause that they're looking for in their fact-finding. This circular notion that we are pricing the products and we're putting that money back into the environment, green infrastructure, helping industries transition to green production methods. These kinds of measures domestically would be very helpful to pass those difficult tests. I'm not sure how difficult they are, but it would help, it would go a long way to that respect. And also, perhaps at the international level, Canada has a lot of international assistance programs. If some of that money is sourced towards developing countries to help education or help research there for those purposes, again, for environmental purposes, for climate mitigation, and so on and so forth. This shows that when you put a price on carbon and when you extend that to your imports as well, you're not doing this because you want to give a leg up to your domestic market or because you have a friend here or there that you're trying to help. No, this is because we want a clean Canadian economy. So this is something to bear in mind when we're looking at a carbon pricing policy, is that there are options that will help the whole economy flourish. And they're there. They will be legal. It is a little bit of a risk. If you look at policies that have never been adopted before, they have international parameters, you go to an international court, you might lose. Yes, of course, all these are tricky issues, but there's also lists of things that you can do as you adopt these policies to make sure that they, at the end of the day, come clean through that litigation process, and that other countries start adopting them. So imagine if we all had a carbon price, if every country in the world had a carbon price, all the idea of border carbon adjustments wouldn't even be necessary, because then you wouldn't need to adjust to anything. That product has paid for its carbon somewhere else. So that makes for a healthier global economy. It takes a lot of time to get to that point, but it's possible once somebody starts. So that's what I want to leave you with, that trade wars might not be so bad if somebody takes the first step to a better global economy for the environment. Thank you. Is that your phone? Is there a pocket there? Oh, no, it's on my phone. Oh, there's already one more. Got to figure out how to use this thing. Okay.
So good evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Nicole, for having me here. Before I start, I just wanted to say a couple of words about the land acknowledgement and what that might mean for people in the room. One of the things that I add to the land acknowledgement is to acknowledge that in addition to the territories of the Indigenous peoples that were here, but also recognizing the caretakers who took care of the territory so that we could be here, and to also acknowledge that we're now the current caretakers. So we have this responsibility as well. If you're living in Canada on Indigenous territories, you have this responsibility to ensure that there's going to be something for future generations. Whatever that something happens to be. So that land acknowledgement you actually have to take very seriously, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So just keep that in mind. So I realized what I should have said here was consideration in Indigenous engagement and climate change initiatives. So it's a tough topic to cover in 10 minutes. So Royal Commission on Aboriginal People 20 years ago. It took about 5 years. I don't have 5 years apparently tonight. Truth and Reconciliation, about the same. Again, I don't have 5 years, but I can probably, maybe in the Q&A sum up what some of the findings were there. But one of the things that I realized I should have had on the presentation, let me just see if I know how to work this. Nope. Is it this way? Nope. Even worse. Okay.
The green one.
Oh, the green one. Okay.
The other green one.
Big green one. Okay.
The big green one, yeah.
The big green one. So I should have started off with the notion of justice. So it's not a secret right now if you've been reading the papers or even if you've been living under a rock somewhere, probably you're aware that there's been, a various crisis involving Indigenous communities in Canada. So there's water crisis, energy crisis, housing crisis. So a lot of the proposed solutions that are coming forward, you can't take that for granted in Indigenous communities, particularly First Nation communities. In terms of infrastructure, those are things that you cannot take for granted in Indigenous communities. So there's going to be different considerations. To me, one of them is first and foremost justice. So Indigenous communities over history, well, I'd say about the last 500 years, have been dealing with dramatic change. So dealing with change actually isn't all that new to us. Usually the change wasn't of our doing, so we're kind of used to that too. Well, not really used to it, but it's happened before, for the last 500 years. But one of the things that does is it makes Indigenous communities very vulnerable. So we're very vulnerable because of intergenerational trauma. A lot of this has been well documented, the various kinds of crisis in Indigenous communities. But it also means that there's something to learn from us as well because we've learned how to deal with change. We've learned how to be resilient. We've learned how to adapt. We've learned how to resist. We're still here despite great effort to ensure that we wouldn't be. So we've figured some things out that can probably help with these questions that people struggle with. But there are unique considerations because of this in Indigenous communities. So I do want you to think about, yes, there's very vulnerable communities, but there's also something to offer in terms of solutions and being involved in meaningful ways in different initiatives. So I'm probably not going to be able to get through all of this. I thought I could wrap this like Eminem and do 4,000 words in a minute. Then you'd have to go home, play it backwards, and figure out what I said. That would take too long. And then I'd get a whole bunch of emails. What did you mean by that? So in terms of the contribution, Indigenous knowledge systems, so this being recognized federally and provincially, Indigenous peoples have this knowledge. Maybe it could contribute. So it's important to recognize that as well. I don't have a lot of time to get into that. But again, thinking about Indigenous communities as being able to contribute. One of the things that I don't see, because it makes people very uncomfortable to talk about, is the history of colonialism. That's a reality in Indigenous communities, and if climate change solutions don't deal with that, then it's not going to be very helpful for Indigenous communities. Because a lot of the situation that Indigenous communities find themselves in is because of that history. So very much related to climate justice is ideas around decolonization as well. Indigenous communities are in a process of recovery, revitalization, and reconciliation. So it's not homogeneous. So it's complex. It's not simple. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, very recent report that came out, talked about this history of cultural genocide. But one of the other things to keep in mind when you're thinking about policy, the structure, institutions in Canada, was it said that Canadian institutions are still very structurally, institutionally, and systemically racist and colonial in how they deal with Indigenous peoples. So those underlying fundamental issues have to be dealt with. So they're that becomes part of our reality. Those are the things that we talk about. So they're not like technical in terms of what people might think as being climate change solutions, but they're very real to Indigenous communities and should be, in my mind, real to everybody else and certainly to the various governments. Then you have the recent announcement around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Canada fully committed to this and said they'd implement it. Read it and see what it says and how are we going to do this? It's going to call for a major transformation in Canada, and what's everybody's responsibility to make this happen? And again, dealing with climate change isn't new because we've been dealing with change. What climate change scientists are just figuring out is, oh, Indigenous peoples have already experienced these changes and knew this stuff all along. They're just documenting it now. So it's actually not new to Indigenous communities. And again, climate justice, it makes sometimes adaptation a lot more challenging because a lot of what we take for granted living in the places that we live in is not the case in First Nation communities. So one of the things I did want to, so there's some things, for example, so the relationship between, let's say, First Nations and the federal government is transfer payments to First Nations for housing. So this is pictures taken in my community. So I would go nuts there because I'd say, why isn't there trees? There's like trees all around. But part of the conditions for housing is that you have to cut all the trees around where you're building the homes. And now in this particular area, it's really hot. Like right now, really hot because trees can help with shade in the summer and make the houses a little bit cooler. But so I'm like, why do we do that? Oh, that's the condition of funding. We won't get the housing funding unless we do that. And then, so it takes a long time. So this is what people have to live with. And in the community, people's electricity bills are sometimes double than the rent. So there's a real energy and electricity use issues in communities, when to me it'd be really quite simple in terms of dealing with it. So you have community planning. It's not really very sustainable, or sustainability planning. That's not really a big consideration. A lot of it has to do with, well, how do we save money? Because if there's trees there, it might fall on the house, and then it costs money and whatever else. But what ends up people doing is they plant the trees anyway. So this is an older part of the reserve, a part of the community where people just started to plant trees. So it takes 20, 30 years to get the trees so that they get the benefits of it. And that would just be, to me, community planning that can ensure some degree of sustainability. But it just gives you a sense of that kind of reality that communities deal with in terms of the conditions of the funding that they get for living conditions at the community level. So one of the questions that I usually get is, why should I be concerned about Indigenous peoples? Like, what does it have to do with where I live? And I always tell people, but if you're living in Canada, and if you're wondering if there's Indigenous interests, there is. So I'm just going to show you a series of maps. So these are historic treaties, contemporary treaties, treaties in negotiation, and try to find a place where there wouldn't be Indigenous interests, Indigenous territories, and responsibilities if you're a treaty person. So it didn't look like that on my computer this afternoon. So historic treaties. So this is where the historic treaties are in Canada. So this area is all, for the most part, treated in some way. Whether even pre-Confederation treaties that Indigenous nations had with the Crown, British Crown or French. So these are the modern day treaties in Canada. And these are the treaties in negotiation. So it doesn't really matter where you are. There's going to be Indigenous interests in what's happening in their communities, what's happening in their territory. So it's still territories. You either have Aboriginal rights or treaty rights to them. And there's going to be Indigenous interests in them. So to me, any initiative should be considering that. Because if you're not, then, I mean, I often call this the matrix, the alternative reality, because people have no idea. Like, they have no idea that there's this reality in Canada that's going on. So what I also wanted to talk about, because I only have a certain amount of time, is one of the things about dealing with change and also dealing with climate change in Indigenous communities, and any proposal, any kind of consideration or any kind of option needs to consider is that the key to adaptation for Indigenous communities is the cultural resilience, is being able to still have that relationship with the land. Like that's the core of Indigenous communities and their well-being, is having that relationship with the land, and families having that relationship, the whole community having that relationship. So that's core to well-being. So I'm an Anishinaabe person, so this is actually shots from the maple sugar camp that my family has. And one of the reasons why that's so important to me is work with Brenda Murphy and some of the First Nation communities that she's working with, and Métis communities that she's working with at Wilfrid Laurier, is that in 100 years, the maple trees aren't going to be able to adapt to climate change, and we may not have them. So this is going to be devastating for Anishinaabe communities, because so much traditional knowledge is passed on there. It's intergenerational. You have a connection to the land. You use language. You have ecological knowledge. You know when you're going to tap the trees, and you know when to stop. So that's going to be devastating. So that's going to impact our ability to be well in our community. So it's very much tied to those kind of activities. And therefore tied to our resilience, our ability to be able to deal with change. So it's my niece and nephew. So these have to actually be strengthened. So any kind of option going forward has to strengthen this in Indigenous communities. This is something that we're already working on. And a lot of the changes that are coming very fast. So the climate change changes that are coming now is really very rapid. People are noticing things. People are trying to adapt to it. But unlike other people, we're on a reserve, and you just don't get to move. So traditionally, before we were dealing with change, and if a certain species of fish that we relied on culturally or for economic activities, we would just follow the fish. Like you would just go. But now you can't do that because now you have boundaries. Treaties have boundaries. Reserve have boundaries. So we're very constrained in very different ways than other people in relation to how we can adapt. And those are constitutional. They're legal agreements. It's legislation. So that's what I mean by institutionally it's set up this way in Canada, and those can act very much as constraints in our ability to be able to adapt and be resilient to climate change. So in terms of, I might actually be on time. In terms of a path forward, again, the land acknowledgement, taking that seriously. Like, what does that actually mean to be on Indigenous territory? What does it mean to be a treaty partner? What does it mean? Like, do I even know who my First Nation, Métis neighbors are? Am I engaging with them in very meaningful ways? So taking that seriously, being a responsible person in this territory. Engaging Indigenous peoples at all scales and levels. So I find what often happens is that thinking about Indigenous peoples, thinking about Indigenous concerns, thinking about Indigenous issues or the challenges that people face or what they can contribute is often an afterthought, it's often an add-on. So I often see that in policy. Oh, yeah, we have a legal duty to consult with it. Okay, we better do it now. And meanwhile, a lot of the agenda's already been set. So First Nation communities, Indigenous communities are often reacting. So I find myself in that situation. So in my position, I'm often asked to comment on things, but I'm commenting on decisions that are already set. Like I'm not really being able to influence in a really meaningful, foundational kind of way. So this is the case with a lot of First Nation communities. They don't have a lot of capacity. We're not doing a lot of the climate change research. I was recently on a committee with a student at the University of Toronto, and she was doing research on winter roads and how they're changing up in the James Bay area. Not looking good, and the funding came from Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. Everybody's names changed recently to stick climate change, same department, stick climate change on the add-on thing. And they were talking, and I said, well, what's your knowledge mobilization? Because this is what we have to think about as academics. And they said, oh, well, we're for sure going to present to the funders, to Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change. I go, well, that's fascinating, but don't you think the community might want to know this? Like what you know about what's happening with the winter roads and how that time is shrinking, it's related to precipitation. So I'm finding that a lot of the science and a lot of the research that people are doing actually isn't getting back to the communities, even though the research is being done on them. So, and they need that too in order to make good decisions. How are you going to govern climate change at the community level when you don't have that information? So, and that should have been intuitive, because in Indigenous research now, the Indigenous research paradigm is the research should always benefit the communities, and you always make sure that people have that information so that they can make whatever kind of decisions they may need to make around that. So, Indigenous knowledge system, it's not data. A lot of it's embodied in people. So unfortunately, a lot of the traditional knowledge research methods is about extracting this knowledge from communities, and people go off and make decisions without them. That's not ethical. So it needs to be a knowledge sharing. If you've got something to share with First Nations, it should be shared. It should be reciprocal. It shouldn't be a one-way street. Like that's supposed to be the old paradigm. I know it still happens, but thinking about Indigenous knowledge systems is very differently. And I teach a whole course on this for 12 weeks. We don't have that much time again today, so it's hard for me to get into it. One of the other challenges, and someone talked a little bit about this, is in terms of jurisdiction. Climate change isn't compartmentalized in terms of how we respond. It's Environment, Climate Change Canada, I think they're called now. So there are different departments who are dealing with this, but the impact that the community feels is not like that. It's not compartmentalized. It's part of every decision, and it's part of everybody's everyday life. It's not in different compartments, because they're often smaller communities. So every decision is almost like a climate change decision. And that's not really how I find the governments are responding to that. It's delegated to different departments, and they approach it in that way. And again, community resilience and adaptation. Sometimes the It's related to gender, your age. So I find that's not often being considered. I've said, what about gender? You need to think about how are women affected by this differently, because what people did on the land is very different. It's also different culturally. What Haudenosaunee people do is different than what Anishinaabe people do. So there's these nuances that haven't really been, I find, thought through. So to me, climate justice is very much related to the recovery of traditional systems and that process of decolonization. If we don't do that, it's not going to go well for Indigenous peoples. Because we know this from 500 years of experience, and we could tell you it's not going to go well, because this needs to happen at the same time, because a lot of the situation in Indigenous communities is basically legal and entrenched in constitution and in the systems and how people are funded. So that actually has to be addressed. What you'll see from a lot of the national Aboriginal organizations and the provincial territorial organizations, they'll always talk about Aboriginal and treaty rights. How are those affected? The kind of fish that Anishinaabe people would have always had for sustenance or ceremonial use, you can't have anymore because they're not there. They're already noticing this in the inland lakes. And again, we just can't waltz over there because that's not where the treaty rights are. So how flexible are the treaties and the Crown in renegotiating these to deal with climate change? So those are questions that haven't really been considered, that are the realities at various scales and levels in Indigenous communities. So I'm going to stop there. I think what I do want to say is just thinking about the kind of questions that you need to ask, that think about this from a different perspective. Indigenous peoples in Canada, particularly First Nations, are not highly urbanized. So again, all these things that we take for granted as being normal, that's not the case with Indigenous communities. There's very unique considerations there because of history, because of the current context, because of negotiation of land claims and self-government agreements. It's not the same. So you need to think about it. And if you don't know, then you need to engage and you need to ask, because I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous peoples. I can speak to what I know and the kind of research that I do or where I live. So it's important to make sure that you're getting those different perspectives and engagement. And I'm going to stop there because Andrew's starting to rock in his seat. So it must mean stop talking. So thank you for coming. I know it was a hot night, but you're just kind of like little heads out there. I can't quite see you, but thank you for coming, and hopefully this was useful to you. Thank you.
So before we get into the question and answer period, please join me in once again thanking all 5 of our panelists. So again, I would invite people to come to the microphones, and there's one just at the end of the aisle here on the left, and then one on the right as well. And again, I do ask that you be brief with your comments and your question, and please. And like I said before, you can address it to the entire panel, and or to a particular member of the panel. And I see we've already got quite a lineup, so I think we will go right into questions from the audience. So, sir, over here.
Thank you.
And please introduce yourself.
My name is Eugene Safronov, and my question would be, I came in half an hour too late, but I came in at the right point where that graph was there with the vegan and vegetarian diet and then transportation. Yeah. So my question is, I know I'm not an environmentalist per se, but there's been so many years talking about taxing this, doing that, all these changes. But from all this new data that we're seeing, like the simple fact that simply going to a vegan or vegetarian diet has more impact than any of these measures that could do, wouldn't the take-home point be, try to adapt governments or try to change policies or to include or to, look towards at how we can change the diet, since it's the elephant in the room?
So what was the question? Sorry.
Sorry. Wouldn't it be more important to look at a diet because it's something that everybody can do? There's so many people that feel powerless as environmentalists because nobody can go and force a government to start, paying taxes on carbon, changing policies, but there's things that we can do, but there's not enough people promoting this lifestyle, promoting things that people, have control of.
Yes, I agree with you. I think we do have influence to get a carbon pricing policy. The government seems ready, willing, and able, and just needs a little bit more encouragement. So come out next week and encourage that. And absolutely, anything you can do to promote a vegetarian or vegan diet is most welcome.
Okay, and it's these industries that get the subsidies. We're here on one hand talking about taxing carbon, but the governments are giving billions of dollars to the animal agriculture, you know what I mean?
Yep, that's another elephant in the room.
All right.
Gentleman to my left.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for all the great presentations. My name is Jay, and I'm an undergraduate student from York University. My question is surprisingly similar. My question is, what is the role of federal and provincial governments to engage individuals to change their lifestyle? Now we have all the big corporations taken care of because of carbon cap and trade and producer responsibilities. How could government engage individuals to change their diet and buy electric vehicles and make significant changes in their life?
I think the government should maybe turn that back to the citizens and ask for some great ideas. One thing I think is, since the provincial government has responsibility for health care, I heard this idea that, you know how we have this little Ontario health premium that we pay every year? Maybe that could be based on your lifestyle.
Before we go to the next question, is there anyone else on the panel who wanted to respond to this particular question?
So I think it's a wonderful idea to have individual options for changing your behavior and your patterns that might affect climate change. But the truth is, in this region, 94% of greenhouse gas emissions come from energy use. And that's not what you eat. It's what you drive and what you plug into the wall. And until you address that, you will not change climate change in the deep way that we need to address the climate issue. So, you have to do both, unfortunately. And even if we all became vegans tomorrow, it still wouldn't address the fact that we're driving cars.
Sarah?
I think it's a great question, and it brings up this challenge of individual behavior change versus sort of the collective government-led behavior change. And my view is that both are crucial and necessary, but it's important to not perhaps maybe give government more power than it deserves in this case. Social movements towards the lifestyle changes that you're talking about can originate in places other than top-down policy. And I think there's some really important domains that Heather's mentioned where the tools are completely within the jurisdiction of the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal government to trigger significant decarbonization. And perhaps it's up to citizens groups, to other sort of actors in our communities to have a conversation about our lifestyles and our values as well that isn't perhaps legislated so much as part of a conversation.
Okay, sir.
Thank you. My name is Sam Nabby, and I have a question about the border carbon adjustment. You touched on what happens to imported products if we were to have a carbon price. What happens to exports?
That's a great question. So initially, if we were to let those products go to foreign markets without having paid anything, so for those export-destined products, we just let them be and they don't pay for their carbon. That, in and of itself, and right now, is allowed by the WTO. So essentially, it would treat it a little bit like a GST, and then you just either rebate it at the border as the product exits or not even charge it at all. That's not an ideal solution, and I agree with you that in principle, this is exactly what starts bothering you, and those industries might as well just start exporting instead. However, before you get to that point, the idea of dumping, of taking your product, lowering the price and letting it go to the foreign market, I think that, again, the important part is to look at the backyard first to fix the system domestically. So I agree with you, there's a deficit there. but it's a next step to fix. It's not to fix yet. And once we adopt a border carbon adjustment, the other ideal scenario is that other countries would start doing the same. They will start adopting carbon pricing because their industries will push in that direction. So then there won't even be that issue for the export destined product. It will go up in pay when it gets to its destination. But that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. We're living in an age right now of being aware of the fact that massive corporations are participating in offshore tax shelters. They're moving monies out of nations and earning revenue. And I believe that that's associated with the accelerated rate of production because they have more liquidity because they're not paying their taxes. On the same note, these same entities are putting themselves at risk because they're removing the liquidity of the investors that originally supported them. So it's like digging a hole, throwing the dirt on the side, thinking you're creating a mountain of growth when you're burying yourself. Now, I want to create policy change at the international level, and I don't know what vehicle I can use as a concerned citizen to do it, because I am seeing right now approvals being done with brand names. And the risk of doing a brand name instead of a registered trade name is that I'm witnessing the transfer of assets during National Energy Board processes. Transfers of ownership during those processes that are not on the record because they're using brand names instead of corporate entities. And I want to get that awareness made internationally right now, and I just don't know what vehicle to use.
The international tax question is such a complicated matter, and you're absolutely right. There are ways where assets are transferred and we can't even see it. However, because it's so complicated, the first part of my answer is I'm not as well equipped, I don't know much about it, to be able to answer with an actual answer to your question, what tools do you use, right? But what I can say is that the WTO, where I'm looking at, is a government-based organization. So you're looking at countries.
Yeah.
So your best bet at that level with the WTO would be to go through your country and pursue this accountability domestically, right? And then that's the idea that once countries start being cognizant about this international transfer of assets, then they will start pursuing those avenues that we can't really find an international platform to do so.
Yeah.
So one of the organizations that does that as an NGO is Transparency International.
Ooh.
They try to look at where are assets hidden. They're not doing this necessarily from an environmental perspective. They're doing this from a corruption perspective.
Yeah.
They're trying to find where the corruption lies. And it's a very interesting example of an organization that has also induced much legislation in countries. And I think that Canada has recent legislation on that. Again, this is not my field, and you should look into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
But I think there are steps that are being taken for this type of,
checks and balances.
Yes, leaking through the cracks, and we don't really see it.
Well, it's like Deborah said, is that the resources are moving, but the people don't.
Yes.
We're stuck in our country.
Yeah, very complicated matter. And we always see those scandals, that we find these tax havens and suddenly names appear on these lists and the numbers, the sums we see are very troublesome. And you're right, but it is a very complex problem, and I'm afraid I really am not equipped to find an answer to it.
It's okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sir.
Yes, hi everybody. This has been a nice presentation. My name is Chad Kasserin. I'm a geoengineering researcher, investigator. I'm a radio show host for a local show called Covert Reality here in Waterloo on 100.3 FM. What I would like to say is one thing clear. I see you talking about addressing issues, addressing what we drive, what we use. It's important to put everything on the table when you're making a decision this big. When you're about to impose a taxation on everybody, you got to make sure everything's on the table, including geoengineering. And that's spraying nanoparticulates in the atmosphere. We know they've been doing this for 10 years in southern Ontario and 20 years in California. And it's causing major drought and imbalances in our world, and our ecosystem is under attack. This whole program here depends on a Paris agreement, which was non-binding, a legal non-binding agreement, okay? There was no legal binding agreement made, and people have to understand this. There was so much push and investigative work done to hold people accountable for spraying our atmosphere that they even, call this crazy, but this is the world we're living in. They created a false flag attack in Paris to stop anybody from coming in to convict this environmental fraud. Now, Maurice Strong, he's a fellow involved in Agenda 21 programs. He had, just 3 days before the summit last year, an announcement came out that he had died. Now, the reason I'm saying this is that now Prince and Merle Haggart had joined the list. These were people working to uncover geoengineering operations that have been happening already. In the end game of this here, you guys are trying to impose geoengineering strategies to curb our problems that we have in our atmosphere and our climate. Well, the climate change, everybody, is called geoengineering. Global warming is called geoengineering. Climate geoengineering, solar radiation management, these are terms that are being used by universities all over the place. They're doing this by nanoparticulate dispersal.
Sir, can I ask you, can you just get to your question?
My question is more or less, how can you make a binding agreement? How can you come here and make all these decisions in the future for us when you don't even put the biggest elephant in the room on the table, is that we're being sprayed in our atmosphere, and it's made the last couple days very, very hot. Okay, and our air conditioners are running. I wonder why. This is the biggest fraud I've ever seen. So I just want to say, if you think that you can go ahead, let's put it this way.
All right. Sir, I'm going to...
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
Can you make an agreement this big without putting geoengineering on the table, without even speaking about it?
Great, okay. Would anyone on the panel like to respond?
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for raising the issue of geoengineering. I think we need to distinguish between the Paris Agreement, which is an international negotiation between nations.
No binding agreement was made. No legal binding agreement was made.
Sir, I didn't say binding.
Sir, can please don't
and what we're here to talk about today, which is what Canada should decide to do, because of course any agreement, binding or not, that is made internationally actually has to be written into domestic law. So we have to bring that agreement home and decide what to do in Canada, right? So that's what's on the table for us today. And I would say that if by geoengineering you mean the intentional manipulation of the climate by injecting particulates and other experimental technologies,
it's been proven.
Into the atmosphere, then there is an ongoing discussion, certainly, about the ethical and moral risks about
the aluminum that's in our ecosystem, and it's in our soil.
Yeah.
This is actually more important.
Sir, I am going to cut you off because we do have a number of people here. Right, sir. There will be a chance. There will be a chance after this to follow up. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks.
Please.
Hi. Sorry? My name is Rachel. I wanted to, I guess, talk about sort of the present reality of this system where we are right now. I think it's important to recognize this is a colonial system. This is a system that apartheid South Africa was based off of. This has implications today. It's very important to recognize that before colonization, the bison herds would pass for days. There were so many birds, like the sky would be blacked out. Like the situation that we're facing today is a product of colonization, and it's not through colonization that we're going to fix it, I would argue. And to that end, I guess my question is, where do we see the evidence, the reason to believe that the federal government will take meaningful action? I think that it's very, 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 very possible, as you have said today, to make the changes that we need to make. And in fact, they're really not that complicated. I really appreciated a lot of what Katerina had to say. A lot of this is coming back to gardening, and it's coming back to bioremediation and really actually simple things. These aren't very complicated things. I did want to point out that the government of Canada subsidizes oil here more than all governments in the world subsidize health combined. So when we're talking about sustainability, oil isn't sustainable. It's literally not sustainable to the point that it has to be subsidized to the tune of trillions of dollars in order to make it possible for us to drive our cars and all that. Meat, dairy, and eggs, same deal, right? We've heard meat, if we go vegan, that is a huge cut. The meat industry produces more greenhouse gases than all of transport combined. Meat, dairy, and eggs are subsidized by the government. I've had somebody accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist on this point, to which I say, yep, all of the ads and all the buses are my conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
My question is, we have Justin Trudeau has made it clear he thinks that pipelines are the key to transition to a green economy. We have Line 9 currently running without consent. We have Site C being built without consent.
Sorry, please.
Where is the evidence that Justin Trudeau is actually serious about climate change, that there is actual change? I would like to hear where you think that's possible. Thank you.
Before I turn that over to the panel, can I please just remind people we do have a long lineup of questions. Please go right to your question, and so that we can hear as many people as possible. Who would like to, to paraphrase, the question is, do we have any faith that the current government is actually going to deliver?
I'd like to say yes.
All right.
I would agree, and there's a couple of reasons why. Partly, I'm pragmatic, and I think we take the wins where we can get them. And I think deeply consulting on a nationwide climate strategy and pricing carbon across the country is a win, and I'll take it. I think that's really exciting. And I was in BC during the time of the carbon tax negotiations, and it made a difference. There's evidence that tax did a lot of what it said it would do. So I find that promising. I also think that there's a lot of other signals at the federal level that are very promising. Opening up to the media, starting this conversation, building stronger relationships with municipalities. These are all steps in the right direction. This is a critical conversation, and I really appreciate all of the points that were raised by that asker. But I would say yes as well.
Okay. Anyone else on?
Yeah, and if it doesn't work out, the failure of any democratic system is, of course, more democracy. So if it doesn't work, do something about it, because it's a democratic system. You own the government.
Okay. All right. We have about 15 minutes left in tonight's event. So again, just please go right to your question without an opening statement.
Oh, geez.
Please.
Sure, lay that pressure on me. My name is Chris Hodnett. I've never been able to come to a point without a preamble, but I will try. In listening to all the things that have been talked about tonight and things that have to change and have to happen to make things work, what I did was I picked a problem that I would like to hear a solution for. How do we get Nestle's out of water in Canada? And that has so many layers to it. It has to do with Indigenous women and responsibility for water. It has to do with the different levels of government coming together. It has to do with, I don't know, maybe pissing on NAFTA or TPP or something. I don't know. But anyway, so I would like to hear answers to that, because that's, okay.
What is the solution to Nestle?
Don't buy bottled water.
I'll drink to that.
Any other?
Yeah, I know that one.
Any other responses?
No. I'll give you my perspective on that, because this was an issue that when Josephine Mondalban was walking around the Great Lakes was dealing with. So, I think it is very much related to Aboriginal and treaty rights, and in Canada, like who actually owns the water, so that Canada tends to see these provinces tend to think of water as being a resource that can be bought and sold and permits given to people to do whatever they would like to water. But from an Anishinaabe perspective, anyway, I don't want to speak for other Indigenous peoples, water is seen as actual entity. You have a relationship to water. You don't sell it. You don't look at it as a resource. So I think And often Indigenous rights, Aboriginal and treaty rights will get employed as a way to raise a profile for environmental issues that you can't get otherwise. But with the water walkers, a lot of it was to try to raise awareness and not drink bottled water, because how is it described? It's a very unethical thing to do to water, I guess, is one way that people talk about it. You're enclosing it, it's enclosed in plastic, you leave it open and the spirit is there. So I think for me, a part of it is just changing one's relationship with it. Now that isn't adopted by the Crown, very hard to get that in. That's a lot of my research is how do you actually get people to think differently about water, like not as being a resource, not as being a commodity. Even internationally with the human rights, the UN resolution that water sanitation and potable water is a human right. It's actually more than that in an Indigenous context. It's actually a relative that's recognized as having its own entity and being. So there's a different ethic around that. There's actually also, you see it with one of the recent court decisions, which is recognizing Indigenous law. So Anishinaabeg water law recognizes water as being an entity. So maybe as different Indigenous scholars, John Burroughs, M.A. Craft, and others start to advance Indigenous law, and that actually starts having currency in Canada, we might start thinking about environment, resources, not as resources that you can exploit, but as relatives that have something to offer us and vice versa. So I think a lot of it has to do with how we understand our relationships. So,
May I just
sorry,
quickly...
that was a bit long-winded, but yeah.
Oh,
thank you. Good question.
May I just quickly redirect one point, though? So
I do want to move on because
I know, but just very quickly. So I know that Nestle's pays like $3 for like 1 million liters of water. Then we have to deal with their damn plastic bottles after the fact. And in the communities around here where they're trying to deal with this, they can't. They're having meetings, but the province has given the leases, the municipality. So, and then when I talk to people in the federal government about it, they say, well, it's a provincial issue. And so this sort of level of government working together. So that's really what I'm interested in. How's all that going to happen?
Maybe after the session we can follow up. All right, so we have, I think, 6 more questions at the microphone. So again, please be brief.
I will try to keep it concise. Thank you so much for the positive conversation here. I think it's really important to keep things hopeful and progressive. So good job out there. Also notice they're all women on the panel. So I heard a lot of really fantastic ideas for how to encourage sustainable development. When we start talking about retrofitting and changing infrastructure, changing the way that properties are evaluated and regulated, I start to be a little concerned because people in lower income brackets, a lot of First Nations people live in areas that will be disproportionately affected by this kind of need for development. So where is the conversation there right now? And if I don't know who could speak best to this, but please, love to hear about it.
Maria.
I have an interesting perspective from the WTO. If you look at annexes that Canada has signed in the WTO, there is consideration for First Nations. Now, whether domestically that takes place is something that I don't know, but they did put it in some of the agreements, and there are carve-outs. So, to me, we're doing a lot on paper. That's what it feels like a little bit with respect to First Nations. And I didn't grow up here, so for me it's also a new subject that I'm looking at. But when I look at the WTO, when I look at those agreements, the annexes are there, the mentions are there. So then I can turn around to the domestic order and say, so what's happening inside? Right? You have the carve-out, it's right there. It allows you to do things. It allows you to take some of that money and address specifically your communities. And nobody will say you're discriminating or you're subsidizing. No, it's there. You asked for it, you negotiated for it back in the day, and you got it. So now, go back and use it.
Great. Sir.
Hi, my name is Peter Thurley, and I actually noticed that a couple of our MPs are in the crowd, and I just wanted to thank them for being here. I thought that was pretty great. My question is pretty simple. You have 2 minutes with Justin Trudeau, and you know he's going to implement your one suggestion. What is it?
Ooh.
All right. Sarah, well, why don't we'll start with you and come down.
I have 1 minute with Justin Trudeau, and I know he's going to do it. Whatever I say.
I think he said 2 minutes.
So much power. Yeah, so, I mean, what to say next? I'll go back to my small business note. I know it's not the sexiest thing, but small businesses produce between 60 and 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the country. They are the foundation of our economy. They're our communities. They're the people who provide us with food and run our cities, and they're us. So endowing small businesses with the resources that they need, the technical and financial resources they need to create solutions that they know will work, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to do it innovatively, to do it competitively, and to do that at a nationwide scale, I think would be a sure win.
Heather.
So I guess I would say, Justin, reform the way we do mortgages and house financing. And that's partly to address the issue of equity that was raised by the last questioner. It is really unfair and inequitable to have houses that are very expensive to own in terms of energy use, and that don't work well for the people who own them. And I think the way in which that is not a visible part of our housing market and is not thought through in how we finance homes is a bit insane.
Justin, could you please use your incredible charisma to negotiate an international carbon fee and dividend system?
So I would ask him to find the agreements that are already negotiated and that are in paper and that are right there, such as the WTO agreements, read them closely and start pushing the boundaries there. I mean, you don't necessarily rewrite the agreements, but you push them a little bit to a better interpretation.
I like that. I think what I would add to it, I mean, my perspective is going to be thinking about, Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations in Canada, is I would say, to start treating Indigenous peoples as nations and people who can contribute, as opposed to a problem to be solved. That tends to be the dominant paradigm.
All right. Sir.
Last question. Okay, my name is Scott, and I know how to ask a question. My question is, how do we amplify the voices of children in this not only their voices, but their action and their abilities, because they're the ones who are going to be living in Delta when it floods in 50 years. So that's my question to the panel.
Who would like to tackle that one?
So I have a daughter who wanted to be here tonight, but it's past her bedtime. And she has a plan to solve the climate crisis by creating star-powered photovoltaics. She tells me it's very high-tech, and it's not yet available, but she will develop it someday. So I think the question that you're asking is partly about how we do science education in our schools and how that needs to be tied more to civics. And real inquiry in our schools around these issues so that kids can get involved, engaged, and start problem solving as early as grade 2.
Great. Thank you.
Can I flip that question a little bit? And I would say my caution would be we often pass these things off to the next generation. We say that younger people have this figured out already. This is in their DNA, the environmental sustainability or whatever. And so when those children grow up and take control, we'll solve some of these problems. Those are very tiny shoulders to be putting all of this on, and that would be too late anyway. That's far too long to wait. So I think kids know where it's at. Actually, I think we need to get our act together.
Right.
And I would also add to that, define children. I mean, you don't stop education, and it never stops. We always learn. I find that I learned so much tonight. learning about these issues is a constant struggle. So it's not something that, as you said, that you put it on little shoulders and just let them deal with it in the future. We learn, we have a responsibility. So the way I would tackle the question, what do you do with children, is I will do my part to learn as much as I can. I won't say some teacher somewhere will have to teach my child. I will try to learn as much as I can, and then I will teach my child by example that I'm doing this, so they should start learning.
Before I go to the next question, how many more questions do we have over here? Can you just raise your hand? All right, 2 more questions? Okay, perfect. And then we will draw to a close. So go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Mo Markham. I heard what was said, that in Waterloo Region that 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions are from energy use. But my understanding is that globally, 18% of greenhouse gas emissions are from the meat industry. And so, and I think what we're here to talk about is climate for all of us, not just what we produce here, but and we're part of that because, you know, a lot of us eat meat 3 meals a day, right? So I'm wondering what suggestions that you can give us that we can ask the government for to do something about that, because, you know, it's happening to all of us. We can't just sit in this little pocket and say, well, we're not doing that, because I think we are. And I'd just like to know what suggestions we could give to the government. There are citizen groups that are pushing this, but, you know, in terms of making it happen fast, which we know all of this has to happen fast, how can we do that? How can we get the government to do something about that as quickly as possible?
3 times a day, really? Good Lord.
A lot of people do.
I'm sort of wondered why, I'm back with Sarah here, why is it that, you know, our dietary choices, a problem for the government to solve? I don't understand why that's not just part of our culture to solve, and not necessarily part of our government to solve.
Well, it is.
The obvious levers at the federal, provincial level. Maybe, you know, and what kind of, I like the local school movement and the way in which schools are trying to include local food systems in their educational structures. That does not seem something that the federal government gets involved in. So I'm a little perplexed at what.
Well, if 18% of greenhouse gases are from the meat industry, and we're talking about climate, how can we not talk about that? I don't understand how we can not talk about that. And I mean, initiatives have to come from the government at some point. I mean, right now they're giving money to the meat industry. In Waterloo Region, a few months ago, they gave $1 million to a meat packing industry. So what can we do? What can we, you know?
Actually, I agree with you. I think there is things that the government can do, which is, like, first of all, stop subsidizing.
Thank you.
Make the health guidelines science-based and not lobby-based.
Okay.
And, yeah.
Can I also add, just so as not to misrepresent my earlier comment, this is actually the beauty of a price on carbon, right? Break down where the emissions come from the consumption of meat, right? The transportation of it, the facilities that produce it. This is where the energy is consumed in the production and the consumption of meat. And a carbon tax, a consumption-based carbon tax, gets at that. And the huge carbon footprint of the consumption of meat would then register. So that signal is crucial. That is definitely a role for the government.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Sorry, I'm conscious of time.
Thank you.
Methane is included in carbon emissions as a greenhouse gas equivalent. It is actually a far more potent greenhouse gas, and as such, that is included in, you know, when we say carbon price, what we mean is greenhouse gas equivalent price.
Right. All right, so
that's long.
We are at 9:01, and I think we have one final question here. Is that correct? Oh. Very, very quick.
Very brief, very brief. Sorry.
A question.
The question, yes.
A question.
You asked, how is the government implicated with the diet? How is it their problem? Just one quick, simple fact. In Canada, the #1 killer of men today is colon cancer. Eating red meat.
All right, I am going to exercise the moderator's prerogative here and close the events. First off, thank you to all 5 of our panelists. I think this was a terrific event, wonderful presentations. And then, once again, thank you to all of you for coming. I think this was a lively event. I sure had to work. But please, we do really value your participation here, and this is a tremendously important issue. And I do encourage all of you to participate in the national consultation that is taking place next week. And finally, before we close, there will be a reception in the lobby outside, so please do stay for that, enjoy some refreshments, and please do come back to CG if there's another event that's of interest. Thank you very much.
means in communities in 2020, 2050, 2100. What do communities look like, and how do we respond? Do we want our community to go down a particular path, like densification, like rapid transit? And what does it look like when we make those changes? So this is a 3D digitally reproduced image of the community of Delta. It's a low-lying, very vulnerable community that experiences flooding and storm surge. It's surrounded on 3 sides by water. And this is what it looks like right now. This is what happens when the dike breaches, when sea levels go up by, in fact, very little. The dikes breach in Delta even now. And so if we have sort of a scenario where there's a storm surge as well as a modest sea level rise, this community floods. So this is what it can look like. This is actually what it does look like on occasion when Delta floods. But if we look forward and we plan, obviously there are ways to respond to and to adapt to climate change in this community. One way to do that is to simply build a bigger wall. That is one option available to communities to keep out this particular climate change impact. But we run into dangers here. If we are taking a very narrow lens on climate change and thinking only about protecting our communities from one single impact, we lose opportunities to find synergies with other priorities that matter to us. So what other options do we have available to us? We could build what they call a green berm. There are examples from all around the world of ways to adapt to climate change that don't involve building a big concrete wall. This, for instance, would create recreational opportunities for this neighborhood. It would sink carbon because it's green and growing instead of concrete. Aesthetically, perhaps more pleasing, enhancing biodiversity in this area instead of cutting right through potentially ecologically sensitive areas. So the point here is to stretch our imaginations, to look around the world, to learn lessons from communities that are a few steps ahead of us, and implement climate change strategies that deliver on multiple priorities simultaneously. I think that's a key message here for both cities, provinces, and the federal government. But we need to do more than simply adapt. What we're talking about here in large part is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating climate change. So this image shows putting those houses up on stilts to also preserve them from rising sea levels. Starting to put some solar panels on top in smaller cars so that fuel consumption is reduced, and essentially gathering that low-hanging fruit of climate change mitigation or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So these are strategies that are available to municipalities, but are most effective and accelerated by strong, ongoing, and well-funded partnerships at all levels of government. So this requires policy consistency between municipal governments, provincial governments, and federal governments, as well as significant flows of resources among those. And finally, let's think about a more deeply sustainable world. Sorry for whoever I'm lasering over there. As I mentioned, lower greenhouse gas emissions is not our only goal. We want, I presume, I hope, healthier communities, more equitable communities, more beautiful, livable communities, as well as cities that are resilient to climate change impacts and lower carbon. This is one vision of Delta in a deep sustainability scenario where we have more local food production, local renewable energy production, different architectural designs, and all sorts of things going on the ground. I would like to highlight that in the case of Delta, one could argue that because of its vulnerability to rising sea levels and storms, it would be most sustainable for Delta to actually not be here at all. So that would be one deeply sustainable world in 2100, would be to not have to rebuild it over and over or protect it so deeply. So this is
Region Blue Dot Movement and the People's Climate March Waterloo. We are here tonight to talk about what our federal government can and should do about the threats posed by climate change, threats to our personal and collective security, our livelihoods, and even our survival as a species. I ask you to consider for a moment the constraints within which policymakers have always worked: finite monetary resources, the legal duty of care they owe their constituents, and the pressures of an electorate that can be at times fickle and self-interested. Now consider that with the crisis of climate change, two new constraints must be added to the policymaker's burden: the non-negotiable limit to how much carbon our fragile ecosystems can bear, and the limit of how much time we have left to act. At no time in history has it been more important for our policymakers to think beyond a 4-year election cycle. At no time has it been more apparent that we must abandon the modern illusion of having it all. If we are to mitigate the most deleterious effects of climate change, if we are to adapt to the changes that are coming, some of which indeed are already here, and if we are to foster a society that is based on principles of justice and human dignity for all, choices must be made, and some of those will be difficult. Being informed and clear about our choices and preparing to express those choices to our elected representatives in Parliament is why we are here tonight. I would now like to turn the evening over to my colleague, Andrew Thompson, a CG Senior Fellow in the Global Security and Politics program. Andrew is also an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo, the program officer for the global governance programs at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and chair of Amnesty International Canada. He is the co-host of Inside the Issues, CG's weekly international affairs podcast, and he has graciously agreed to moderate this evening for us. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Nicole. It is a great honor and privilege to be tonight's moderator. And for this evening, each panelist will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and we will go in the order in which they are seated, beginning from my far right. Following the presentations, we will have about 30 to 40 minutes for questions from the audience. And for the question and answer period, I invite people to come to the two microphones that are located just in the main aisle here. Before you ask your question, please do introduce yourself. And I invite you to ask questions of the entire panel or particular members of the panel. And I do ask that you keep your question short and focused so that we do have time for as many questions as possible. We have an absolutely stellar cast of panelists tonight. Sarah Birch is a CG Senior Fellow with the Global Economy Program and an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environment Management in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, where she researches climate change, urban planning and responses to climate change, and renewable energy. Sarah is a coordinating lead author of the second assessment report on cities and climate change, and was a contributing author to the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. She holds a PhD in Resource Management and Environment Studies from the University of British Columbia, as well as a BA in International Relations and a Bachelor of Science in Environment Science from the University, both from the University of Calgary. She's held a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Oxford's Environmental Change Institute and a Banting postdoctoral fellowship at the University of British Columbia.
Having me. I wanted to draw attention to this full house. This is really incredible. I wouldn't presume that all of you agree with each other on this issue, but it's striking to have this many interested people in the room together on a very hot and steamy evening to talk about a pretty complex issue that I think really comes home to roost, as I'll discuss here in communities like Kitchener-Waterloo. As Andrew mentioned, I'm at the University of Waterloo. I'm in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management. I'm sometimes a political scientist, sometimes a geographer, but I focus on how climate change plays out in communities. What municipalities, what urban spaces can do to respond to the challenge of climate change, and also broader, deeper sustainability issues. And so that's what I'm here to speak with you about today, about the ways that we can view climate change sort of through the lens of sustainability. Consider all of the things that we want our communities to be, to chart a path forward for Canada. Wrong green button. We're in a time of incredible change in the world. We have evidence accumulating upon evidence that change is accelerating. We're in the midst of this great acceleration, a rapid migration from rural to urban, accelerating consumption of resources, but not all of this is bad. And I struggle with jumping down the rabbit hole of the doom and gloom we often associate with climate change, because it tends to be fairly disempowering. We lose the wind in our sails when the problem seems so massive. But obviously on social and economic indicators, we are actually making some significant improvements all around the world. And so I think it's most important to think of this time we find ourselves in as a period of massive change. Clearly, one of those dimensions of change is our emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, leading to, as we know and have observed, significant climate change. So this is an important thing to reflect on in our communities. In Canada, we're also in a period of massive change. We obviously just had a change in government, and we're in this current process of consulting on what Canada should now do in terms of a nationwide and province-by-province climate change action plan. We self-identify, it would seem, as a resource-based economy, of course, and that has created, I would think, many roadblocks to transition towards renewable energy and low-carbon living in Canada. It turns out we're also a renewable energy superpower as well. We have spectacular resources in this country. They vary province by province, but the resources are available to trigger a transition, to foster a transition towards renewable energy, if only we are to take the tools in hand that other panelists will be discussing throughout the evening to trigger that transition. But I think it's important to bring all this down to where we all live, to understand what the impacts of climate change and responding to climate change actually mean in cities. And then this needs to trickle back up to the federal level and inform our national level climate change plan. So we have to think about our cities. This is where it happens. This is where the climate change impacts play out. This is where renewable energy transitions play out. This is where our local economies are, our small businesses. But this is where we work and live and play. So the structure of our cities, the way they function, has incredible impacts on what we can see as our future with or without climate change. So let's look at our cities. I'd like to use a couple of images here just to bring it home for you. Some work that I've done in the past over the last number of years. I'm a relatively recent import, 3 or 4 years now from Vancouver, from the University of British Columbia. And we've done significant work along the coast and in mountain-based communities to actually visualize, create a vision for what climate change.
Heather Douglas is the Waterloo Chair in Science and Society in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Waterloo. She received her PhD from the History and Philosophy of Science Department at the University of Pittsburgh and earned a BA in Philosophy and Physics at the University of Delaware. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation. She has recently been a visiting fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. She has served on numerous scientific advisory boards, and her work focuses on the interface between science and policy. with particular attention to the role of values in science, the nature of scientific integrity, the relationship between citizens and experts in democracies, and the norms that should govern the weighing of complex sets of evidence use in policymaking. Katarina Lindman is an actuary and mother of 4. She's very interested in ecology, health, and climate change. She enjoys working with other actuaries and climate scientists on the challenge of communicating the state of science with others through the development of the Actuaries Climate Index, which will be launched in the fall. Katarina also works on climate policy by leading the Waterloo Region chapter of the nonpartisan Citizens Climate Lobby. Maria Penezi is a postdoctoral fellow with CG's International Law Research Program. She holds a PhD in law from Osgoode Hall School at York University, where she was a Nathanson Fellow and a Comparative Law and Political Economy Fellow. She received her first law degree from Athens University in Greece and was called to the Athens Bar. She's published articles on issues related to public international law and was a W.C. Langley Scholar of International Legal Studies at New York University School of Law, where she received her LLM. Maria has been an adjunct professor at Osgoode Hall Law School and has taught ethical lawyering in a global community, as well as law and economics, for which she received the Ian Green Award for Teaching Excellence. She has also been a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Last but not least, Professor Deborah McGregor joined the Osgoode Hall Law School faculty in 2005 as a cross-appointee with York University's Faculty of Environment Studies. Professor McGregor's research is focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including water and environmental governance, environmental justice, forest policy and management, and sustainable development. Her research has been published in a variety of national and international journals, and she has delivered numerous public and academic presentations relating to Indigenous knowledge systems, governance, and sustainability. She has recently completed a SSHRC-funded research project, Traditional Knowledge, Water, and First Nations in Ontario, and is currently involved in 3 additional studies. Prior to joining Osgoode, Professor McGregor was an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Toronto and served as director for the Centre for Aboriginal Initiatives Aboriginal Studies program. She also served as senior policy advisor, Aboriginal Relations at Environment Canada, Ontario region. In addition to such posts, Professor McGregor remains actively involved in a variety of Indigenous communities, serving as an advisor and continuing to engage in community-based research. Please join me in welcoming tonight's panel. So we will start with Sarah.
Good evening. Thank you very much.
The climate is changing. Extreme weather is disrupting livelihoods and food supplies around the world. This is observed. This is documented. This is the scientific community's consensus. The climate is changing. Carbon emissions are driving that change. Emissions come from burning fossil fuels. So if we want to slow or even reverse the change, we must lower our fossil fuel use. By charging a fee on fossil fuels and returning that revenue to households as a dividend, we can do just that, starting a chain of positive effects. Fossil fuels become less desirable. Cleaner sources of energy become more competitive. The dividend creates millions of jobs. Carbon emissions go down. Reduced air pollution saves tens of thousands of lives. And climate change is brought under control. We can make this happen. But enacting a carbon fee and dividend isn't in our hands. It's in theirs. How do we sway them? What can we do? We can use our voices to express political will and demand action. We must help our elected leaders work together. It's on us to tell them what we want as a group. Because when voices call out together, their impact multiplies. The government can respond to the will of the people, provided we tell the government what we want. And what we want is a livable world. This is what Citizens Climate Lobby works for, to empower citizens to connect with and influence their members of parliament, to spread the idea that each one of us can address climate change. Bring your voice to citizensclimatelobby.ca.
Good evening. Welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation. My name is Nicole Langlois. I'm a publications editor with the International Law Research Program at CG, and I am also a member of Divest Waterloo in my personal life. Our group exists to support organizations and individuals in the transition to a low-carbon economy through fossil fuel divestment. Before going further, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our gathering this evening is on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. On behalf of Divest Waterloo and Citizens Climate Lobby, tonight's 2 main organizing groups, I would like to extend our thanks to CG, and in particular to President Rohinton Medora and our events and digital media staff for hosting and fully supporting this event. We are, of course, grateful to the various experts who enthusiastically agreed to be part of tonight's panel. Their willingness to share their research and ideas with us is greatly appreciated. As I'm sure you all know, our federal government has invited public input as it develops a comprehensive climate strategy in pursuit of meeting its ambitious commitments to the historic Paris Agreement on climate change. A full public consultation for this region is planned for next Thursday, August 18th at 7 p.m. at Kitchener City Hall. I encourage all of you to attend the consultation, as well as the pre-consultation information session that begins at 5:30 that evening, as a means of registering your thoughts and opinions on this critical matter. You can find out more about what we have planned for August 18th at our information table in the lobby or on the events page of the Divest Waterloo website. I would like to acknowledge and thank the local environmental groups that have teamed up with Divest Waterloo and Citizens Climate Lobby to plan next week's consultation and who have supported our efforts to bring all of us together tonight. Those groups are Sustainable Waterloo Region, the Waterloo Regional Labour Council, Transition KW, REAP Green Solutions, Sustainable Campus Initiative, Chippewas of the Thames Solidarity Working Group, Waterloo